In the final installment of this lecture series, I'm going to talk about how professional journalists working for broadcast media organizations like TV channels and newspapers are using the internet, especially how they're using social media. I'll talk about both the new opportunities and the possible pitfalls that social media present for journalists. When we hear about journalism and the internet, often the conversation is about the way that the economic model on which journalism depended for the past couple of centuries is basically collapsing. Newspapers can't rely on classified ads, for example, any longer as a big revenue stream. And as I previously mentioned, digital intermediaries like the big social media companies are really coming to dominate the advertising market. In part, this is because those platforms have such large user bases, and also because they collect so much personal data on their users that they can then use to micro-target ads to them. So advertising on these social media platforms has become increasingly attractive to advertisers as an alternative to, just placing an ad in a newspaper and hoping the right people see it. And more than that, the access to such a tremendous amount of information that the internet has allowed us all to have has, I think, led to kind of a cultural shift where we have the expectation that news should be free. Both free like free speech, but also free like beer at a frat party. So subscriptions to newspapers and magazines in many parts of the world have fallen dramatically in the early 20th century. Although they've begun to stabilize a little bit, at least for big national and international publications, though local journalism is still really struggling to survive in a lot of places, including in the United States. Anyway, so there's this big economic story, this challenge of big new economic challenges that the internet has created for journalism, but that's actually not what I want to talk about today mainly. What I want to focus I want to focus away from kind of social media as a channel of distribution that journalists are struggling to make money off of, and instead consider how journalists are using social media themselves as a channel for news gathering, as a means of sourcing information for the news that they produce. Just as in the early 2000s, there was a lot of optimism that the internet could democratize knowledge and create a new kind of well-informed citizenry participating in democratic politics, there was a lot of optimism that journalists could use social media themselves to become better informed than ever and to broaden their perspectives and interact with people they previously didn't pay enough attention to. I think that mood of optimism is reflected in a 2012 article titled Tweets and Truth by Alfred Hermida, a journalist, one of the original creators of the BBC's news webpage, and now a journalism professor in Canada, University of British Columbia. Hermida said that Twitter in particular carried a potential that some journalists were already at the time beginning to make clever use of, but Twitter had this potential to serve as an awareness system for newsworthy events. What he meant was that a journalist could be constantly keeping one eye on Twitter, which provided a constantly updating feed of information from anyone the journalist chose to follow, both colleagues and also non-journalists. And then when something happened, when something newsworthy started going down, that journalists could quickly notice and focus more intensely on that subject, even as they continue to keep their other eye on their Twitter feed in case there were some other further developments or some other important events that transpired. And in a sense, this isn't kind of groundbreaking to a lot of us. This nowadays is the way that many of us operate, right? Constantly checking our notifications and our various social media feeds. But it's worth recognizing that this possibility to be constantly monitoring so many different sources of information was pretty new. Before Twitter, which only launched in 2006, a newsroom where journalists worked might have a wall of 20 different TV news channels, all playing in the background basically as an awareness system, but that was still less effective than Twitter, right? It only caught breaking news stories that TV channels had already done their reporting on, that where once journalists had already arrived at the scene and so on. With Twitter, though, journalists could be constantly tweeting and reading each other's updates as events unfolded. They could be monitoring what everybody else was doing. And of course, they could carry Twitter in their pockets with them, in their phones, instead of needing a whole wall of TV screens. This kind of media ecosystem of journalists, professional journalists, also amateurs and eyewitnesses and anyone else who wanted to participate, kind of constantly feeding in new information, putting together the pieces, checking each other's work. Hermida called this ambient journalism. So information is constantly in the air. Updates are constantly flying in. It's all in the ambiance. And Hermida argued that in this context, in this new world of ambient journalism, journalists kind of needed to rethink their role. In the 20th century, according to Hermida, the verification of information came to be seen as central to journalism as a profession, as a discipline. The journalist's job, right, was to figure out the facts, to verify them, to filter out the lies and red herrings and irrelevant information, and then publish that verified information. And then they were done. Verification was the act of a single expert journalist, or maybe kind of a team of journalists all working together at the same news outlet. And then it was kind of a one-off exercise to publish. You verified, you went to press, that's it. But in the age of social media, what Hermida saw developing was a new form of verification, a new form of verification with kind of a different temporality and a different means of collaboration than the old model.
If you spend time listening to your Twitter followers and talking with them, you might discover that they are subject matter experts. They have areas of expertise that you could never dream of. They have been eyewitnesses to things in their lives that might serve useful in your reporting. There is no way that one reporter can know as much as your community of followers combined on any given topic.
Now, using Twitter especially, but also other social media, journalists and others were constantly feeding information about breaking news stories into the ambiance, into the Twitterverse. Some of that information was verified, some of it was unverified, and in fact, journalists were using Twitter to verify information. A journalist might post a photo or video of some event that allegedly just happened, and that journalist might ask their followers, is this real? Does anybody recognize this location? And so instead of being the task of one lone, intrepid reporter, verification became a group activity. It became the product of what Hermida called collective intelligence. And once something was published, whether printed in a newspaper or just tweeted out, the verification process wasn't over. People would reply and comment on Twitter, pointing out falsehoods or adding new information. And so verification was becoming this continuous iterative process of building up a better and better image of what was going on in the world. Kind of a more and more refined and accurate pseudo-environment, as Walter Lippmann might have put it. Now, the problem, which Hermida briefly mentions, but I don't think sufficiently acknowledges, or at least didn't back in this article in 2012, is that although accurate information might emerge eventually out of this process of collective and public verification, along the way, lots of information gets published, right? Not all the hot takes and breathlessly tweeted information is correct. In fact, a lot of the real-time information usually turns out to be inaccurate and only gets improved over time through this process of iterative collective verification. And along the way, there are many, maybe millions of users of social media who see these unverified, semi-verified works in progress as they're coming out on Twitter, but then never see the follow-up corrections and reinterpretations, either because their attention gets diverted or elsewhere, right, to some other subject before the truth really emerges, or because that initial misinformation confirms their biases and their assumptions, and so they accept it as truth and then refuse to believe subsequent corrections and refinements of the story. Normal users also don't necessarily have the training or expertise or experience of professional journalists who operate in the Twitterverse and know to always take breaking news with a grain of salt. And so they might assume that whatever they see is true, or at least whatever they see that they agree with. And this is something that fact checkers, for example, constantly complain about. Particularly fact-checking organizations that have collaborated with social media platforms to add disclaimer labels to stories that they have deemed false. Very often what happens is that by the time a fact check is complete and a warning label is added, the damage has kind of already been done, right? The misinformation has already reached millions of people, most of whom have moved on to other issues and don't even see the belated fact check. So the speed at which social media runs carries both advantages, right, like being able to detect breaking news stories quickly through this awareness system, and disadvantages. There are also disadvantages to the speed at which information travels, right, like the viral spread of misinformation. Another reason we should, I think, be maybe a little bit skeptical of the optimism that comes through in Hermida's argument is that he doesn't really think about the ways in which Twitter and other social media platforms are themselves potentially biasing journalism. They might be leading journalists toward some sources and stories while making others effectively invisible to them. Right? And so here I think it's valuable to kind of combine the two different stories that I've been laying out here in the two parts of this lecture. So first, social media platforms, their algorithms, their terms of service, their moderation policies. Social media platforms have become powerful gatekeepers in the global flow of information. Second, journalists are relying heavily on social media to verify information and more broadly to kind of figure out what's going on in the world for them to report on. So if we consider, one, journalists are social media users, and two, social media users are subject to gatekeeping by platforms, then we can conclude as a syllogism that journalists are subject to gatekeeping by platforms like the rest of us. So the point being, right, that the awareness systems upon which journalists now rely are not neutral or objective. They don't provide journalists with some unfiltered view of what everybody is saying online. These awareness systems are showing journalists information that their content moderators have not filtered out and that their algorithms deem relevant. And some actors are better able to game the system, right? To have their content promoted more heavily in the algorithmic allocation of attention. And some actors are better able to kind of toe the company's moderation practices lines and also have the power to get their opponent's content taken down and their opponent's accounts locked, right? So there's, as I discussed in the previous part of this lecture, there is still inequality in who is visible on social media. And so the limitations and kind of the blind spots of the social media awareness system is worth considering. And that's actually something that I'm doing in my current research. I'm looking at how journalists in Latin America, in Mexico and Venezuela specifically, looking at how journalists are using Twitter as a news gathering tool and as an awareness system. And I'm trying to come up with methods that could help them to gain access to a greater diversity of sources than they do when they rely kind of unquestioningly on Twitter's relevance ranking algorithms, and particularly the algorithm that recommends new accounts for those journalists to follow. So I'm thinking also about kind of the ways that Twitter itself, right, as a platform, could change the way it operates in some ways and could be helpful in making their criteria for ranking relevance more transparent and also in even perhaps providing users some control over their system for ranking relevance and providing recommendations. Perhaps some advanced users, like journalists, would be interested in seeing recommendations of accounts to follow that are quite different from them, who instead of kind of increasing the echo chamber effect by feeding back more of the same kinds of information and the same perspectives, might be able to give these advanced users, if you like, of Twitter access to new online sub-communities and to new perspectives. So that's something that I've been thinking about and working on. But anyway, nonetheless, since 2012, since Hermida's article was published, Twitter has really become a completely standard tool for journalists. This use of Twitter as an awareness system and a tool for collective verification has really become the norm for journalism across much of the world. This was certainly the case I saw in Mexico and Venezuela. And one of the outstanding examples, I think, of the way that journalists, professional or otherwise, can use social media is provided by Bellingcat, which is an investigative journalism site, which was run actually at least initially by complete amateurs, particularly led by a British blogger named Elliot Higgins, who didn't come out of a traditional journalistic background, but who, like his collaborators at Bellingcat, shared kind of an obsessive attention to detail, and also really a savvy in using social media to find information and to collaborate with people around the world who knew more than they did and could fill in blanks that they couldn't. Since 2014, they've done these incredibly detailed open source investigations, meaning like investigations relying on publicly available information from whatever sources they find useful to them. They've been conducting these open source investigations of military attacks, of crimes, of human rights violations, these kind of things. And in numerous instances, using information that they collected on Twitter, videos shot by eyewitnesses, and also by using other internet tools like Google Maps and things like this. They've in numerous cases actually convincingly kind of debunked narratives and lies really of powerful state actors, particularly the Russian and Syrian governments, about essentially about war crimes that they've committed. And one thing that I like about Bellingcat is that unlike many social media influencers and bloggers and even comedians, right, who nowadays are the news sources that a lot of people rely on and trust, Bellingcat doesn't really rely on kind of this claim to be, an authentic countercultural voice, like fighting against the man, fighting against the corrupt mainstream media. Bellingcat doesn't rely on the charisma or the personality of Higgins or its other investigators in order to kind of earn unquestioning trust of their readers, of their viewers. In fact, they're actually pretty much all uncharismatic, very nerdy guys. Instead, their claim to trustworthiness, to authenticity, is all about transparency. They take advantage of the fact that that an online article that they publish on bellingcat.org doesn't have to have any of the same length and formatting constraints as the traditional media, right? As an article published in a newspaper that's only allotted 500 words, or a TV report that has to be done in just a few minutes. And really what they do is they publish pretty much every single piece of evidence they've found in order to build their argument. And in each of their articles, they kind of walk you through what their argument is, what information might disprove their argument, but how it doesn't hold up. So instead of saying, trust me, they're saying, here, evaluate the evidence. And their audience isn't I'd say their audience isn't primarily ordinary people, who might not actually have the training and the ability to evaluate all that evidence. But instead, I think they largely found this niche for themselves where they're writing for journalists, working for the mainstream media, and also increasingly they're writing and producing these investigations for legal systems, both in individual countries and internationally, like the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court. They're providing documentation that might in the future be useful for war crimes prosecutions and things like this. Of course, the downside to the length and detail of their posts is that they really face an uphill battle in attracting ordinary people's attention as compared to, the simplistic, clickbaity, misleading counter narratives that Bellingcat's opponents or the people Bellingcat is often reporting upon critically, like the Russian government and its supporters, are often putting out there onto social media, and to kind of muddy the waters and to sow doubt among the masses, among ordinary people. So Bellingcat, is finding these interesting new ways to do investigations. Whether they're actually able to, compete in the marketplace for loyalties effectively against these state actors that they're reporting on is questionable, I'd say. And speaking of online bullshit, I think that it's kind of, as an aside, it's worth thinking about Bellingcat in comparison to some of the other internet researchers, quote-unquote researchers, whom I've discussed in these lectures, particularly the QAnon community, this far-right online conspiracy theorist network. On a superficial level, if you look at QAnon, there's kind of a passing resemblance to Bellingcat, right? You've got lots of different internet users connected via social media, piecing together information they find from a wide range of online sources, right? They're in a certain sense, they're conducting open source investigation. But the key difference, I think, between Bellingcat and QAnon is really the kind of empiricist orientation of Bellingcat, and more objective by Walter Lippmann's standards, if you remember from my last lecture, the more objective methods of Bellingcat, right? They actively seek out information that might disprove initial claims and assumptions, and when they do settle on a claim, they try to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt using evidence that could actually hold up in a courtroom. Also, they kind of limit themselves, I think, to answering questions that can be answered empirically and with minimal kind of opinion and interpretation, right? Bellingcat sticks to questions like, did the Syrian military use chemical weapons against its citizens? How was Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 shot down? And this focus, right, kind of avoiding often bigger questions like, is the revolution justified in Syria? This focus to questions that can be factually answered, I think, allows Bellingcat to be relatively, scientific in their approach and objective in Walter Lippmann's sense. QAnon, on the other hand, is much more kind of narrative-oriented rather than scientific, if that makes sense. Like the narrative provides the fundamental basis. They kind of already know the answer to the question when they begin their investigation. And research for them is not an exercise in seeking out information that could contradict their narratives and assumptions, but rather kind of finding any scrap of information that could tenuously support and extend their community's narrative, fictional narrative about the world. So it's kind of more a communal exercise in building a self-contained alternative reality rather than an exercise like what Bellingcat engages in of trying to create the most accurate possible representation of the real world. So again, Twitter and the internet more generally can and is getting used in lots of different ways. It doesn't actually fix any of the problems that I've previously talked about, but what it does do is perhaps intensify and accelerate both our truth-finding abilities and our bullshitting and brainwashing abilities. Some have argued that the solution, at least for those of us who aren't trained and paid to cover breaking news stories professionally, the solution might be as simple as slowing down. This is a central argument to Jennifer Rauch's book, Slow Media, which I'd recommend. And kind of in building off of, in a certain way, the same logic as Hermida, right? That truthful representations don't emerge immediately online, but are gradually and collectively built up. Rauch actually goes in a different direction and argues that it's better for us, in our effort to be well-informed citizens, to avoid constantly jumping from one breaking news story to the next, and instead read articles and view programs that have taken a much longer time and much more deliberation to put together. It's actually better, she says, to kind of wait until the initial dust settles of the kind of claims and counterclaims that unfold in the ambient journalism Twitterverse. It's better to wait for all that frantic, real-time verification activity to settle. It's better to wait for a more refined representation of events and what those events mean to emerge. And it always takes time for that to happen. I, for one, am fairly sympathetic to this argument. I mean, those of you who follow American politics closely, right? Just imagine if you had been in like a log cabin with no internet access during the 2020 election night, or really the 2020 presidential election month. Imagine if you weren't following all the results as they were released in real time, all the allegations swirling around that ended up getting proved false over the next weeks through this process of verification, right? Imagine basically how much happier and calmer a person you'd be. And in the end, you could probably learn just as much useful and reliable information if you just read a single well-researched book or even a really good long-form magazine article about what went down after it had kind of been sorted out what did go down. And there are some slow media movement news outlets that along these lines have been trying to focus on quality and deliberateness over quantity and speed. The Atavist magazine is one that I recommend for long-form stories by authors who really intentionally avoid speed. They avoid covering breaking news, and instead of covering whatever the latest sensation is, what they do is they write about stories that were making the headlines months ago, or even potentially years ago, but that most journalists and news readers have since forgotten about as they've moved on, but that nonetheless remain interesting, important stories that can shed light on parts of the world that readers might not know much about. And so atavist articles tend to be both more factually accurate and also much richer in context and in kind of broad understandings. Certainly than as compared to like social media posts or breaking news articles, which never, even if they get the story right in a factual way, can never have as much context and can never put things into their full context because those events are still unfolding. But these forms of journalism, right, like kind of long form, slow journalism, are of course attracting much less attention and are than their fast media rivals, and are struggling to come up with sustainable business models in today's news economy. So we'll see how things shake out with the internet news economy over the next few decades. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching this lecture series through to the end, and I hope that it's been useful.